Okay, hello? Great, there. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to DCRI Research Conference. It's my great pleasure to introduce our visiting professor and speaker for today, Dr. Joe Selby. Dr. Selby received his medical degree at Northwestern University and completed his clinical training in family medicine. He also received a master's in public health and epidemiology from University of California, Berkeley. Most recently, he served as the director of the Division of Research at Kaiser Permanente, and he has a very prolific research career with interests primarily in diabetes outcomes and quality improvement. He was elected to membership in the Institute. What is that? It's not me, is it? Okay. Sorry, he was elected to membership in the Institute of Medicine in 2009 and has also served on the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality Study Section for Healthcare Quality and Effectiveness. Currently, he is the first executive director of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and we're very pleased to have him here today to be speaking to us about exciting times in research. Thank you. Welcome, Dr. Selby.
Hello, everybody. Am I amplified? Okay, good. Thank you, Connie. Thanks for everything. I know you have to go, but thanks for guiding me around this lovely campus for the last day and a half. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk about getting started at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, Pukui, has been very exciting in many ways because Pukui kind of landed on the healthcare scene at the same time that a lot of trends were converging, and so we happened, it feels in many ways like we were wound up at the right place at the right time with resources, and you know, as you know, a number of other funding institutions aren't blessed with a lot of resources these days, so it puts us in a very interesting position. We have a lot of suitors, a lot of people advising us what we should spend the money on, but it is exciting, and two of the ways in which it's exciting I'd like to talk about today, and I'd like to end this fairly quickly so that we can have plenty of time for questions and answers. So I'm going to probably talk a little on the fast side in thinking about getting through, and assuming also that you know a fair amount about Pocari already. So, and I hope you can see this. This is from the legislation, and it illustrates what a broad mandate we were given. So we were supposed to help assist patients, clinicians, purchasers, and policymakers make better informed health decisions. We were supposed to do that through funding research, including evidence synthesis, and also, by the way, we were supposed to disseminate research findings. So that's about as specific as it got. You know, certainly no particular areas were supposed to be focused on or were mentioned or called out, although there were some criteria for kind of guiding us to high impact areas. This is our multi-stakeholder, 21-person, GAO appointed, very high profile, very involved, very committed Board of Governors. And they were handed the legislation in all of its inscrutability in November of 2010 and set out to figure out what a Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute should do. How it got its name is an interesting question. Nobody can really quite tell me how Pocari came to be called Pocari. That was my first question when I got to DC, in fact, because I knew it was really, the legislation just talks about doing comparative effectiveness research, comparative clinical effectiveness research, but that phrase had a very bad connotation in 2010, and they were not about to name an institute after it or assign that name to an institute. So they, one way or another, they hit up on the name Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, even though there was not such a thing as patient-centered outcomes research at that point in time. But there was patient-centered care. It was really, there had been a lot written about patient-centered care and about shared decision-making at that time. The patient-centered medical home had already been conceived and tested in a few places by that time. There was patient involvement in the planning of new services, patients involved in improving the safety of services. There was patient involvement was just beginning in the area of performance measurement. Maybe we ought to ask patients what they value in terms of system performance and quality improvement. And underlying all of that, there was a tradition called community-based participatory research. So that was what was kind of in the air at the time the Board of Governors convened. So they did some work, and one of the first things they did was to define what we meant by patient-centeredness, and this is still in our application guidelines. So patient-centered research is proposed research that compares treatment options that actually matter to patients. Are these realistic choices faced by patients or by other decision makers? We tend usually not to fund placebo-controlled studies, and we don't fund studies of a relevant dose of one agent to an irrelevant dose of another. So is the choice a choice that matters to patients? And secondly, does the research include the outcomes that are genuinely of interest to patients, to their caregivers? So there's a range of outcomes, and we encourage our applicants to consider all of them and to discuss, if they can't measure one, to discuss the implications of not being able to measure it. So the notion is there's generally a broader set of outcomes that matter to patients than the research has covered up to this point in time. So that's patient-centeredness. But they went further in creating their mission. They actually said that the research would be guided by patients, caregivers, and the broader healthcare community. So this goes beyond the notion that you've got to make sure your research is relevant to patients. This says you need to engage patients and clinicians, caregivers, policymakers as you formulate the question. So this notion of engagement of patients and stakeholders also took hold very early in Pocari's thinking. And in fact, these are the review criteria, and actually for those of you who've applied for Pocari funding before, note that the review criteria are changing with this most recent solicitation. There are now 5 criteria instead of the 8. Your applications will be a little easier to organize. The first one is kind of a typical NIH ARC-like criterion called the impact of the condition on the health of individuals and populations. The second is a complex one. I won't go a lot into the details of it now, but the potential that this study could actually improve healthcare and outcomes. The likelihood that the study's findings could change current practice. So we are not about trying to understand mechanisms of disease. We are not generally about developing new tools. We are about answering questions that will change practice. The technical merit is your approach, your analytic approach, your research plan, study design, your research team and environment. But then there you see 4 and 5, patient-centeredness as I defined it, and patient engagement. Have the researchers included relevant patients and stakeholders on the research team? So that's a pretty big departure from the ways that you organize your applications to ARC or NIH, although there's some modest drift among them as well. Come on in. Why do we put an emphasis on engagement? Well, and I want to emphasize here that I think Pocari engages every bit, sets an example in this regard. We engage patients very early on, before the study question has been settled on. We engage patients and other stakeholders to help identify the topics that we should study, and then to help prioritize the topics that are selected. So we have advisory panels, which you may have heard of. Jillian provided I'm not sure if you're officially a member of the panel or if you provided a lot of support in terms of topic briefs for our advisory panels. They help us identify the high priority questions. When an applicant submits an application to us, they are instructed to include patients and stakeholders in the conduct of the research, but their applications are always also reviewed by study sections that are 30%, not one representative patient, but 30% patients or other non-scientist stakeholders. These study sections have actually had pretty remarkable results in terms of the feedback of the participants on their success. And one of the main reasons then that we do this is precisely so that we have a better chance than average that our findings, if they merit dissemination, will be disseminated. First of all, we helped to ensure that it was a relevant question. Secondly, we helped ensure that the study continued to be conducted with fidelity to the original question. We've got patients and other stakeholders watching for the results, so hopefully that will give us a head start in terms of getting this disseminated. Engagement might mean the inclusion of the relevant specialty groups or the patient advocacy organizations as part of the research team. We also use the patients and stakeholders on the advisory panels to help us evaluate our portfolio over time. So I do think it's fair to say that we practice what we preach. We are told in the legislation to conduct comparative clinical effectiveness research, which simply means that we do address those practical questions of interest to patients, that the research is conducted in typical patients in typical care settings, so broader, broader populations, so that the findings generalize to a greater proportion of the patient community, that we consider the full range of outcomes of interest to patients and other stakeholders, that we pay attention. I'm not going to talk about this more right now, but if you have questions about it later, it's a very interesting area, that we pay attention to possible differences in treatment effectiveness in patient subgroups, the what works for whom, the heterogeneity of treatment effects. Our research may be randomized controlled trials. It may be observational studies. So right now, the mix of stuff we funded so far is pretty close to 50-50. But we do not do cost effectiveness analyses. We don't even do cost comparison analyses. And we can talk about that in the question and answer period if you'd like. Despite the fact that we don't do cost analyses or cost effectiveness analyses, the U.S. Certainly has a problem on its hands. This paper says that national health expenditure projections, and you know they've been relatively flat these last several years, but growing only modestly. But the projection is that beginning in 2014, with the advent of increased coverage and the recovery of the economy, that we're going to start quite a rapid escalation again, so that healthcare spending is expected to accelerate to 7.4% per year as the coverage under the Affordable Care Act picks up. So, and the average rate of growth between 2014 and 2021 is expected to be 5.7%. So again, we're back to inflation in healthcare costs much greater than the growth in the GDP. So this is a problem. What does that have to do with patient engagement? Well, there are, in Washington, I would say everybody has concluded now that fee-for-service medicine, that volume-driven incentives for healthcare are the problem. But they have two very distinct solutions. Toward the right, we have so-called market-based reforms. That's usually expressed in some version of a defined contribution. Rather than covering a set of benefits, we will give you an amount of money, and you will then have skin in the game. Health plans will compete on the basis of cost and quality, and patients will be in the driver's seat. That's the logic there. The alternative is more centralized reform, and that's more what wound up in the Affordable Care Act, since it was driven exclusively by the Democratic side. And that is more, the emphasis remains on defined benefits. Healthcare providers wind up going at risk and having skin in the game. Accountable care organizations, bundled payments, those types of policy interventions are hoped, it's hoped that they will help to curb what otherwise would be a really rapid escalation in healthcare expenditures as coverage expands. So this is just a diagram of how things can go wrong in an environment of volume-based incentives, clinicians and patients trying to make decisions. If they are faced with defined contributions, so really cost sharing, substantial cost sharing, it's pretty well known that this kind of cost sharing tends to drive down the use of even highly effective preventive and chronic disease care. So having to pay and worrying about costs is going to drive down the use, and has been shown over and over again with really effective therapies, preventive strategies. So that's a concern with the defined contribution. The concern with the defined benefit accountable care organizations is that we will see a decrease in the availability of elective care and queues and rationing. So fears in either direction. What might help that? Well, two things could help it, we'd argue. One is better evidence. So evidence tends to combat something like an incentive-driven just on the basis of volume. But the evidence is probably not going to be that useful if we don't also improve the ability of patients and clinicians to discuss the evidence, to consider it together, and do shared decision-making. And shared decision-making has been shown repeatedly, in fact, to lead to better decisions, more satisfaction with the decision, and in many cases, moderately lower costs of care. So presenting the evidence, having the evidence, and presenting it in a useful way to clinicians and patients so that they can participate in shared decision-making in this country, in this volume-incented country, tends to drive utilization down some. So I present this just as an argument that getting patients more involved in identifying the evidence they need and then in shared decision-making, even though Pocari cannot address costs or cost effectiveness, still there is reason to think that this is going to have a benefit not only on outcomes but perhaps even on costs of care and on more rational utilization. Just a point that putting the patient at the center is not unique to healthcare and not new. Just like performance improvement and the safety movement in healthcare, they actually came over from industry. So customer centricity has been around for a long time. As a matter of fact, Ford Motor Company initiated a customer-centered marketing program in 2000. And in 2010, General Motors followed suit and in fact had the same name, a customer-centered program. So these programs in business, they have a lot of resonance with what we talk about in healthcare. So you shift from a supplier perspective, that volume-driven perspective, to a customer perspective, from thinking about units of utilization to thinking about the life cycle of the customer. You think about understanding and responding to customer preferences and recognizing that there are differences, there are segments in the market, just as we talk about there's differences in preferences in patient populations. Moving from off-the-shelf products to more flexibility and customization. Treating customers as advisors in the product development enterprise. So that is customer centricity on the business side. Again, a lot of similarities to patient-centeredness on the healthcare side. Henry Ford is rumored to have said this, which shows that they weren't always customer-centered. If I'd asked my customers what they'd wanted, they'd have said faster horses. So in around 2010, Henry Ford, and it's arguable whether he actually said this, but this did reflect his attitude. He said, "We will give them any color they want as long as it's black." So in 2016, In 2016, Ford Motor Company controlled 67% of the U.S. automobile market. By 1927, General Motors had introduced a wide range of cars tailored to customers' preferences, and they had dropped to 15%. So maybe Ford began getting a notion of the importance of patient-centeredness that long ago, but certainly by 2000, they were a leader, and they did better in the first decade of this century than General Motors did. Maybe losing a battery. So you probably know that we have a broad solicitations related to each of our priorities at Pocari, in which we issue these broad announcements and say, send us your best ideas. Be certain that you partner with patients and stakeholders as you put your applications together, and be sure to attend to our review criteria. Submit your applications. They will be reviewed by those merit review panels that I mentioned with 30% patients and stakeholders, applying those 5 criteria, and we'll wind up with a diverse portfolio addressing patients' questions of high priority to Pocari and to patients. And in fact, that's what we're getting. We've now funded 76 applications through this process, 2 rounds, and we're in the 3rd round. The 3rd round's finished, the 4th round is now open. And indeed, we get a very diverse set of studies across a range of conditions, but we do get studies that look different than what you'd expect to find at NIH or even ARC. So here's one. I don't know if by any chance the principal investigators of either of these studies are in the audience. If they are, this is Janet. Her name got somehow removed from here, but it's Janet Becher, right? Becker. And so Janet is doing a very interesting study where this is an observational study. It links a national stroke registry with CMS data to capture outcomes, and also with a large observational study that captured a lot of self-reported outcomes. It's basically a set of contrast, comparative contrast between different strategies for post-hospital stroke care. One comparison is for patients who elect to go to be in an inpatient rehab setting. It compares the intensity of that inpatient rehab post-discharge from the acute care hospital. And for patients who elect to go to the community, it compares several approaches to doing care in the community. It has the potential to impact decision-making. She actually convened patients to talk about what mattered. Patients helped to choose the outcomes. The outcomes were independence, living independently and out of a nursing home. That was the primary outcome in this patient-centered study. So we think this has a potential to impact decision-making about placement post-stroke. We love the way that she engaged patients to identify the primary outcome, and she has a really strong team, including a lot of stakeholders, including 2 patient stroke support groups. So an impressive observational study. And then this is Chris Cox. I don't know if Chris Cox is in the audience, but Chris convened patients who had survived intensive care unit ventilator treatment and identified psychological distress post-discharge, and an inability to cope as a huge problem from the patient's perspective. It kept patients engaged throughout the process of putting this application together, has a very thoughtful dissemination plan. This is a randomized trial of 2 telephone-administered strategies post-discharge. One focuses on skill building and coping, and one is more of an educational intervention. So again, so 1 randomized trial, 1 large observational data study. So that's basically the end of part 1. The excitement, I think, is that we're beginning in many ways to see a democratization of research. The end users of research are being pulled in. I believe we're going to see a different kind of research, a different set of questions. As I talk to people around here, I get the sense that a lot of people already understand that, are doing it, that the questions are changing. And I showed you a little information that suggests that maybe a closer focus on what the end users say are important questions will actually have a beneficial effect, not only on clinical outcomes, but on costs of care. The second idea I want to sort of talk about a bit is this notion that we could build a national data infrastructure to conduct efficiently and repeatedly patient-centered comparative clinical effectiveness studies based in real-world delivery settings. So this is I call it the holy grail of Washington, D.C. Everybody in Washington, D.C. that has heard of the electronic health record thinks that we can now harness those records and just do quick one-off comparative effectiveness studies, find out how things are working in real-world settings, and medical care will progress rapidly. So these are just some of the players who were involved and have made major investments before we arrived on the scene. The Office of the National Coordinator in HHS has spent a ton of money and time and sheer effort putting out meaningful use, trying to get electronic health records spread across the country, and electronic health records with some common data standards built in, really creating a foundation that makes it reasonable to begin talking about this kind of a notion. The FDA has funded very large activities, including the Mini Sentinel, which Leslie is very central to, a 130 million person patient drug safety database, if you will, or a federated set of databases built largely on claims data, but beginning to include more and more electronic health record data. ARC has made a lot of investments in kind of the methods of how we would do this, distributed research networks, practice-based research networks, registries, comparative effectiveness studies embedded in healthcare systems. NIH has made major contributions over the years through the CTSAs and SEER registries, but the collaboratory, which Rob heads and which Leslie is also involved in, and a number of you are involved in, is a very exciting study that kind of jumps the gun on getting the data put together and just says, let's do big CER studies in healthcare systems. A number of other NIH efforts. The VA has been a leader in comparative effectiveness research based on their electronic health record and their personal health record. The IOM has pushed with any number of meetings and reports and publications on the learning healthcare system and the digital infrastructure for that system, but promoting the idea that now that systems have electronic health records, they should begin harnessing that data to learn what works. Payers, health plans like the HMO Research Network, Optum, Insight, WellPoint, many others are beginning to harness their data for the purposes of research. Specialty societies have built registries in a number of conditions, none more than in cardiology, most of which are housed here at Duke. Industry has come along and made major investments. Their hope is that they can make clinical trials less costly. And then there are innovators and entrepreneurs. And I've got two up there, Patients Like Me and C3N. C3N is a patient-clinician network focused on inflammatory bowel disease and other pediatric illnesses. And Patients Like Me, I suspect most of you know, but it's an online community of patients with any number of disorders who can ask questions of each other and increasingly participate in research. So all of these folks share this vision that we ought to be able to do better and take advantage of the dispersion of the electronic health record. So one of our first big conferences was down in Jillian's old neighborhood at Palo Alto at Stanford. And this was called a workshop to advance the use of electronic data. And we went in thinking electronic data is spreading. What are the barriers to really getting its use, getting it used for research, and maybe how could Pocari help? So that was the notion of clinical data networks based in systems. But we brought patient organizations to the meeting. Patients Like Me was there, C3N was there, a number of other patient groups, Cancer Commons. And those patient groups taught us quite a lesson that day, that these clinical data networks, the numerous ones that existed, had done extraordinarily little about reaching out to even let patients know that the research was going on, much less to involve them in choosing the research questions. They had done very little in the way of randomized clinical trials, which most of us agree is going to be a large chunk of CER is going to be randomized trials. So we came out thinking that there were really two approaches to building research networks. One was what we went in thinking about, the clinical data networks, but the other was this notion of patient-powered research networks. And we just articulated some key characteristics of a national infrastructure. And this is not extant at the moment anywhere. This is what we'd love to drive toward, or do our part, contribute to getting toward. We want data resources and infrastructure that covers large, diverse, defined populations from usual care settings. And by defined, I mean you need to know who you're looking at from moment to moment. They really have to be cohorts. It can't just be the people who got discharged from the hospital, because you don't know if you'll ever hear from them again. So you need to figure out a way to know that you're following people forward in time, or if your ability to follow them stops, you need to know when it stopped. So you can really treat the population like a cohort. You've got to be able to capture complete longitudinal data. Given that people have had one treatment or the other, what happens to them downstream? You have to have the capacity for collecting patient-reported outcomes, because in most comparisons, some patient-reported outcomes are going to be a part of the answer, part of what's important. We think that, and we posited this at the meeting, that whatever system you build, it has to have active patient and clinician engagement in the governance of data use. What came out of that meeting was there has to be a business case for everybody. For the patients, there has to be a business case. For the clinicians, to worry about the data that goes into the systems, there needs to be a business case. For the systems that are allowing you to be in there and working, doing the research, they have to be convinced that they're getting as much out of it as they're asked to put in. And so that's a bit novel compared to those old clinical data research networks that had been in existence and came to this meeting. Has to be efficient in terms of costs for data acquisition, storage, and analysis. And this, to me, speaks a lot to the involvement of the system, the parent systems as well. Has to link to those systems so that when findings emerge and they deserve dissemination, dissemination can be rapid. And critically important, has to be capable of randomization. These systems, where the patients are being seen, where the care is being generated, have to be willing to entertain the notion of randomization. That's one of the reasons I think the collaboratory is so interesting, because suddenly there's 7 big system-based randomized trials. We'd like to see this infrastructure come and actually make those trials easier, both in terms of identifying the eligible patients and following them over time, and more effective. Now, who could participate? I come from a place Kaiser Permanente, where the health plan and the hospitals and the ambulatory care are kind of all folded together. All the data flows to the same place. You follow people forward in time. You know exactly when they leave Kaiser Permanente or when they die. And so you've got some of those ingredients, some of those database ingredients. What Kaiser doesn't have is it doesn't have the variation in practice that characterizes our country. It often doesn't try those brand new, unproven therapies that you'd love to do comparative effectiveness on. It's not, some people would say it's not the real world. I'd say it's a version of the real world, but it's not the only version. So not every, you couldn't build a national infrastructure just on the basis of integrated delivery systems like the VA, Geising, or Kaiser Permanente. You're going to need, among other partners, patient organizations to bring those patient-powered networks and activated patients, practice-based research networks, collecting data in various clinical settings, may be a part of the solution, medical groups that increasingly own electronic health records and collect data, integrated delivery systems, we've talked about them. There may be a role for there's obviously a role for bringing CMS into the picture because they capture the outcomes for very large numbers of patients. State and county health data may also have a role if you're building a geographic population. Medical centers, academic medical centers, other large medical centers, hospitals they're almost 100% electronic health records now. A lot of data, specific data on treatments. Health plans have the denominators. Health plans know who's under observation. They know when observation starts and stops. They also capture the claims regardless of where a person gets care. So you discharge a patient from your hospital and they choose to go to a different hospital when they have a complication or need follow-up. The health plan knows that if you don't. So there's a strong role for bringing the health plans in. And then, very interestingly, especially here at Duke, disease registries capture higher quality and richer data than any electronic health record currently captures. They lack, oftentimes, the longitudinality and the comprehensiveness of data. But again, there's a question about how these could be merged with these, or these medical centers to really create as rich as possible a data set. So, what are we funding? So we are putting $56 million on the table to fund up to 8 new or existing clinical data research networks. And what they have to do, we want at least 2 healthcare systems to come together and work on standardizing their data. This might be an academic medical center with 1 or 2 health plans that they do a lot of business with. It could be 2 different integrated delivery systems coming together. They've got to be willing and able to work toward data standardization with the other 7 awardees. So we don't want them just to standardize their own data, but we want data standardized across all participants. And we want them to be willing to participate in collaborative studies and to share data readily. We do not want to pay them $7 million or more to build a data set that they then feel is their proprietary data set. So this is really about open science and data sharing and being open to other researchers with good ideas. At the end of 18 months, so this is a cooperative agreement, goes 18 months, they need to have at least 1 million patients enrolled. They've got to have the data standardized within their network and with the other awardees. They have to have patients, the systems, and clinicians engaged in governance and use, and they've got to be capable and willing to implement clinical trials. And if they do all that, there will be a phase 2. Similarly, the patient-powered networks, we're expecting $12 million up to 18 new or existing PPRNs. So that's about $0.5 to $1 million per PPRN. We're looking for patients with a single condition, organized because of an interest in participating in research. We want them to be able and spend their time increasing both the size and diversity and representativeness of their patient networks. We want them to build a standardized database that's interoperable with the CDRN databases, and we want them to explore collecting electronic health data, possibly in partnership with 1 or more of the CDRNs. So we want to see the PPRNs and the CDRNs coming together. They have to aim for a target size by the end of 18 months of 0.5% of the U.S. population. Now, for people with very rare diseases, who we are interested in, for patient groups, just 50 patients may suffice. Even for the most common, 10,000 will be enough. So and there's expectations that they will survey the data and prove that they can collect patient-reported data on at least 80% of their cohort. We want them to be the leaders, actually, in involving patients in governance. So we want them to sort of help influence the clinical data research networks in terms of involving patients in governance and use. And we want them to generate standardized data that are suitable for sharing with other infrastructure members. So it will look something like this. There will be these up to 8 CDRNs. There's only 4, I guess, in this picture, but up to 8 CDRNs, up to 18 of these PPRNs, all held together with a coordinating center. And there's also an announcement coming out shortly on the coordinating center. And that guided by a steering committee, which has representatives from every awardee, Pocari, AHRQ, NIH, FDA, ONC, CMS, and perhaps others, all on the steering committee. All of these folks represent people who either have access to data, who know about data standards, or who have future intended uses for this and may be able to be funders, because we would like to see this become sustainable and widely used. There will be a scientific advisory board. Our methodology committee at Pocari will be among the members on this board. And there will be a special expert group which will have representatives from electronic health records and patient vendor groups and pharma and industry on it. So this is the group that will work together toward data standardization and building that vision over this first 18-month period. In the end, we anticipate collaborations across the country, sometimes involving all of them. Sometimes it'll just take, a couple sites, but definitely covering the country. And it is just the beginning. It's a daunting task. We talked about it some this morning with Rob Califf, just the complexities of everything from dealing with IRBs and privacy concerns to the complexities of convincing systems that they need to talk to their patients about research and involve them in making decisions about what to study. So that's the second exciting idea. And I would just ask you in closing to think about joining us, either applying for funding, by all means. This is the website where you can find the announcements, and there are quite a few open right now. But also look on the website for opportunities to volunteer to be reviewers. As I said, I think these technical reviewers, as well as the patients and stakeholders, come out of these sessions reporting that the meetings were really quite rich and the discussions valuable, and oftentimes they're surprised. They anticipated worse. So I'll stop and hope there's some questions. Thank you very much.
Actually, Joe, I just wanted to follow up on a point that you made about the inclusion of patients in these study sections. I know for those of us who are very much accustomed to the panel of peers reviewing our research, that has given us a little bit of pause. I wonder if you can share some of the positive and maybe challenges, the positive aspects of that, and what some of the challenges have been as well. Okay. We have been interviewing the participants as they leave, and we've been looking at the scores, both pre-discussion and post-discussion. And what we see is a pretty wide divergence of the scores after folks have reviewed the applications at home, between the patient stakeholder reviewers on the one hand and the technical reviewers, scientific reviewers on the other. After the discussions, they come much closer together. And that's about all I can tell you right now, that they were almost not correlated at all pre-discussion, but the discussions brought them much closer together. Interviews with both patients and stakeholders pretty overwhelmingly say that both sides feel that the other side added value, and the scientists feel that the patients and other non-scientists added value, and the patients and stakeholders feel that they were listened to. So that's if you had any other question, I may have an answer, but that's what comes to mind. That's what we've been hearing. I think I showed you the 5 review criteria, and we need to really watch that closely. And we spent a fair amount of effort discussing what we meant by patient engagement and patient-centeredness, and we may need to kind of now
adjust a bit and put some more emphasis on the other 3 criteria as well, now that people have got that down.
Joe, thanks for a great talk. And you and I chatted this morning a little bit about some of these governance issues that, you know, the leadership of these healthcare systems, you know, the leadership of Kaiser, to put you a little bit on the spot, you know, was in charge of running the health plan, not making sure you had good quality research data. So kind of 2 parts. One, you know, what are ways in which you're working at the governance level, either AAMC or national associations, to tell them we're going to go beat up on them to try and do something about this, because otherwise we're not going to get access to these grants. And then the second is, you talked a lot about technology, and it's no secret that kind of everyone's working on Epic, and you had some experience with that. How is that experience kind of shaping? Any hints for people about where they, you know, what's useful in terms of data structures and architectures to do this kind of work?
Yeah. Well, it's true that when I was at Kaiser, despite the fact that they occasionally funded a study, you could occasionally get Kaiser Permanente to invest in a study that you know, had relevance in their eyes and interest to you. It wasn't very common. It didn't seem to be nearly as common as it should have been, given the amazing data resources, given the fact that they were divided into regions and medical center populations of 150 to 300,000 people, given the fact that they had practice variation from facility to facility that was, you know, really worthy of study. It was tough, and I think it's tough anywhere to convince decision makers, policy makers, that research is the right way. On the other hand, when you did have the occasional success and you got them to fund a study, it was sometimes almost frightening how quickly they embraced the findings and moved to implement them. So it gave me a sense both of responsibility but also of possibility that, in fact, systems could come around to appreciating the potential that the $5 billion investment they made in research, in data, could really be leveraged for a modest amount of money to do good research. So and I think that the hammer that we will use with systems is the money that we're putting on the table. So $7 million for the first 18 months, and if you've demonstrated that you're a system that really gets it, that can participate, that's willing to participate, willing to consider randomization, willing to talk to your members about the fact that you're doing research, to be supportive, then there's the phase 2 is almost a certainty. So that's the second part. The third part about Epic is, so probably a number of the awardees will be working in systems that have Epic, just given its widespread distribution, but almost as certainly some will be using other systems, and it'll call for you know, some solution like a common data model. What we're hopeful for is that we'll be able to kind of have a proposed strategy to put on the table as we first convene, and then folks at the table will, again, with the vision of that increased funding in mind, be able to find their way through to create a common data model that is a model that looks similar from setting to setting, and built substantially on a collaboration between the awardees and the sharing of expertise by those awardees who've been at it longer with those who are just getting started. So there will be some very sophisticated Epic users there who've managed to pull that data out of Clarity and managed to put it into a you know, a useful format for research. And there'll be others that haven't done that yet. Eric.
And again, thanks for coming and visiting. I know everybody who's met has had a great opportunity to spend some time with you. It's a great honor. My question's a little bit different. You have embarked on leading, or your program has embarked on a remarkable new mission, right? If you think about this for the country, small little tasks like increasing the use of evidence-based therapies, decreasing variation, decreasing disparities, ultimately improving outcomes for everybody around the country. Not easy jobs.
In 5 years to do it.
In 5 years. Well, so that's what I was going to get at. On the one hand, you've taken on a lot of different tack and strategies than have been done by other agencies. How do you assess success, and what is a fair time frame for success ascertainment?
Well, it probably won't surprise you. We spend an amazing amount of time hammering out a strategic plan. And the strategic plan kind of, it says, here we are, and we're going to do this, this, and this. That'll lead to this and this. And then if all this happens, then that will lead to an increased availability of usable evidence. We will speed implementation of evidence into practice, and we will influence the way others do research. And that, in turn, will lead to better healthcare decisions, better health care, and better outcomes. And we get evaluated in 2017, and it's an interesting question. We could have said, what is the really, this phrase just drives me crazy now. I used to kind of like it, but I sure don't anymore. The low-hanging fruit. What is the low-hanging fruit in research? Where could you get like a lot of quick bang for the buck? And the other question is, what are the right studies to do? And I think we're probably going more along the way. I mean, we're always on the lookout for quick returns, but they're not as. It's not as much low-hanging fruit, I think, as the mental image would suggest. So what we think is if we show progress along that pathway that I mentioned, from here to these outputs, to these intermediate goals, to these longer-term goals, to the impact, the GAO, which is the entity that evaluates us, they're actually populated with evaluation experts, with evaluation gurus, and that is the way they think. So part of our plan is to say, look, research takes longer on average than 5 years to be conducted and to impact practice. And here we are. We've got, here's a list of 50 really compelling studies that are underway. Here's the timeline for their delivery. Here's the outputs that we've produced along the way, steps we've taken to make sure that they disseminate. And so that's basically our strategy for 2017, to try to chart a course that anybody will see as important, to celebrate the activities that are underway as well as the ones that are completed. And if there is low-hanging fruit along the way, by the way, if you have suggestions for low-hanging fruit, please, Pocari.org, or call me. How many people in the room have applied for Pocari funding? Good. And I'm going to assume some of you haven't heard yet, so I won't ask how many of you. I know the two that have been funded haven't. Well, any other questions? Think patients can be successfully engaged?
Is there anything you can tell on the board call where you talked about the initiative coming up trying to increase the collaboration between researchers and patient engagement?
Oh, thanks. Thanks for mentioning that. Yes. About July of this year. So as Leslie suggested, this notion of what engagement looks like has troubled some researchers, particularly I think researchers who've been used to doing research without engagement. It does strike me that we fund a lot of pretty junior researchers, maybe because this notion doesn't seem so strange or foreign. But we really recognize that both on the researcher side and on the patient and patient organization side, there is a need to sort of seed partnerships. And so in July, we will have an announcement called Engagement Awards, relatively small awards, a fair number of them, that will be specifically intended to support the formation of new partnerships between patients, patient groups, and researchers. So I think researchers can be advised that if they're feeling that they really need a little time to build up an engaged patient and stakeholder community, these awards will be there.
Joe?
Thanks for asking.
Oh, yeah, I really, one other piece, this patient-centered bit. There's Brad. I was looking around for Brad Hirsch, but he's not here right now. We just did a grant with a couple of disease family, rare disease cohorts. Kathy Giusti, I don't know if you've met her at the Myeloma Foundation, has this amazing model that they built up of really patient engagement, accelerating research. But but it's actually divorced from the infrastructure, same with patients like me. And so it's kind of interesting. If I'm not sure the two would ever link up, because if I have a rare disease cohort, there are going to be 50 patients at Duke. And why would I bother building an interface for 50? I mean, I like your idea of them being in the same ecosystem, but forcing them to work to each other. The Myeloma Foundation is basically frantic. Don't tax us with any other administrative tasks. We have a mission, we have a goal of advancing myeloma research. Don't distract us with things that are nice for somebody else, because we're very mission driven. And you might end up with that. If you're lucky, you'll get a lot of people like that. And so as you're thinking through this mental model, the only thing there may not be a reason to integrate the two other than through the steering committee level.
I think that's a very good thought, and I've wondered about that as well. And there are a lot, as you know, a lot of active organizations, particularly in rare conditions. The rarer the condition, in many ways, the more motivated patients are to get together to do something about stimulating research. Now, whether and this will be a decision that individual organizations have to make, there's also, both the FDA and the NIH have particular interests in rare diseases as well. And they have some suggestions for registries. They've each built out a concept of a kind of a common registry that could be adapted by people with a given chronic rare disease. And those folks are involved with us in the thinking. But I think some groups will opt to work with us. There's a need to expand, and there's a need for them to get, there's a value in them getting electronic health record data. So that's kind of where the partnership might make sense, is to get, to bring electronic health record data into the mix.
No, I think they'll want to work with you, but think of them as a personal health record.
Yes. No, in fact, I think sometimes we will start with people who've coalesced around a personal health record, and we'll have to figure out ways to make that interoperable. But I've often thought too that we really might come to a steering committee meeting, and the people with the patient-powered networks for much of the day will meet with each other, and the CDRNs will meet with each other, and they'll, as you said, come together for a steering committee meeting near the end of the session, because there is a lot that won't be of common interest. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming.